In Edgar Garcia's book, Emergency, Reading the Popol Vuh in a Time of Crisis, which appeared 2 years ago, there's an episode in which he considers the literal meaning of the title by which we know that Quiche Mayan sacred book, the Popol Vuh, the original copy of which resides in the Newberry Library in Chicago, close to where Professor Garcia is Associate Professor of English and Creative Writing at the University of Chicago. The literal meaning of the title is Book of the Mat, and the mat in question is both the ceremonial mat on which a village council sits as they hand down advice, and a figurative mat that marks the limits of the Mayan world. Moving from the holy book to our present day, Garcia asks whether the migrations from Central and South America that have been in the news for the past several years, and all the more so today, given the events of the past 2 weeks, whether those migrations make for an unraveling of the mat of Mayan culture and society. Placing the Popol Vuh alongside stories and poems about the power of walking as an act of culture making, and several recent and present day accounts of the persistence of worldviews despite threats and across distances, he concludes that the mat is only growing larger. Quote, in these theaters of death and forced migration, there is so much life, resilient through its walks, and in that walking, bringing dignity and prestige to the desert lands and their fine-edged, knife-like beauty. Now, this episode represents the method of a poet and scholar who moves easily from past to present and back again, who sees in, for example, the Popol Vuh, a book of emergencies, both of its time and of our time. When we were envisioning this year's week's visitorship, Edgar Garcia embodied, in my view, a kind of scholarship, transhistorical, rigorous, creative, all at the same time, that we need now more than ever. And I've been very much wanting him to bring him here to share his work in progress and his approach with our graduate students and faculty. Edgar may remember it was about 1.5 years ago, we were at the Renaissance Society of America, and I said, I want you to come for this Martha Sutton Week's visitorship. We plan these things way in advance. Edgar Garcia is the author of not only the book I mentioned, Emergency, but The Playful Skins of Columbus, A Dream Ethnography, 2019, and the magisterial Signs of the Americas, a poetics of pictography, hieroglyphs, and quipu, 2020. He's collaborated on the anthology American Literature in the World, and with the painter Emin Orhion on an artist book titled Infinite Regress. For the past 2 years, he was visiting editor-in-chief of the journal Fence, where he edited special issues on topics such as what's the problem with American poetry right now, and the gods. At present, Professor Garcia is working on several projects, including a collection of essays on the Baroque and the Americas titled Caravaggio's Americas, from which today's lecture is taken. We've been waiting for this. So glad to have you here, Edgar.
Thank you so much, Roland. That was so warm, welcoming, and generous. The danger with so beautiful an introduction is that now I have to live up to it. I'll do my best. I'm going to be talking about saints, sinners, snakes, devils, churches, paintings, in other words, the Baroque. On the drive from Tucson to Nogales, through the saguaro forests of the Sonoran Desert, crawls out of the heat an old Spanish colonial mission named San Xavier del Bac. Set in the Tohono O'odham Nation Reservation, the mission is a desert confluence of the colonial world in which it was built, a southwest structure whose cultural flows come Spanish, Mexican, indigenous, and American. Alongside the saguaros fruiting in the desert heat, The church is both stark and extravagant. A white dove, it has been called, in the red land, who has ruffled its wings into a frillback, its reddish orange eyes looking at you defiantly. If you don't know what a frillback is, I would encourage you to look it up on your phones because it is the most Baroque animal you will ever see. Why defiant? Because there is something about the church that doesn't conform to quick description. If you set out to learn something about it, you'll find it sometimes described as Moorish, as if its arches and arched motifs weren't pierced through by fake doors, windows, and other portals for the saints and heavenly entities of the infidel. Conversely, you'll find it sometimes described as Gothic, as if those portals respected John Ruskin's true Gothic as a bulging out, quote, in fear of the rain, which the church does not, with its east tower forever incomplete in a desert gesture of supplicating exposure for nourishing waters from above, a terrestrial portal open to the sky's gathering clouds. If you continue to read, you'll find that, like just about any complex colonial structure of the Americas, at some point or another, it ends up being described as Baroque. Closer to the mark, perhaps, but not for reasons entirely satisfying to me. Because at that moment that you say the word Baroque, those defiant eyes dilate. The wild desert dove draws you into its amazing stare. You must ask yourself, what has this native bird of the Americas to do with that most deranged of European cultural dispositions? And with that question, the desert has already begun to pull you into its labyrinth. After all, the mission was, as you would learn from your reading, built not by Europeans, but by the Otham, the people of those lands, between 1783 and 1797. Its general design likely came from Querétaro, New Spain. There has been a tradition, therefore, of seeing San Xavier as a northerly example of Spanish colonial style. And in seeing it that way, there is a tradition of splitting Spanish design from native labor, Spanish artists from indigenous builders, and Spanish minds from Otham muscle. The idea is that these colonial churches were the intellectual product of a Spanish education, work by gente de razón, right? People of reason, that guided laborers to the artful construction of a properly Christian edifice, such that so many buildings are the product of a single unified colonial mission of education and conversion. Naturally, I think this is wrong. When you take a closer look, the differences between even these churches of the Americas reveal themselves, carrying their own references that are local and specific to their time and place, indigenous. The tremendous burden of labor involved in building San Xavier, the mining and production of lime and clay, the digging of trenches, the laying of stone foundations and brick walls, then the arduous construction of the entire thing in a baking hot clime was done by the Otham. They were paid in provisions like wheat, maize, and sugar, which was necessary since the work of building the mission prevented them from tending to their agriculture. Still, the fact that they could not tend to their crops while they toiled at the church must have stayed with them. It must have concerned them to dedicate not just so much of their time, physical energy, physical effort, and mental energy to the building project, but to give over so much water to it as well. Consider that their traditional constructions were built of wood, needing no water, whereas the process of making mortar and stucco from the slaked lime and of making clay for bricks all required large amounts of that resource precious in this desert environment. Water is so precious a resource here that most traditional Otham ceremony has in some way or another to do with proper actions to bring about water from above or to divine its location. Water, and especially its embodiment as rain snaking down from the sky, is a core feature of Otham religious life, which makes sense for a desert society. It should come as no surprise, then, that throughout the entire church, there appear smuggled symbols of this holy relation between humans and rain. After a few minutes walking through the church, once your eye settles into the foreground of images, and icons and can look more closely at the side things, the apparently peripheral molding and ornamental flair, you would be struck in particular by the disturbed relation between relief and pattern that surrounds you. That is, between the rounded cornices of the church and a zigzag snaking its way over the curves. The relation between form and figure could not be more infelicitous here. It is almost painful in its opposition. Immediately, it reminded me of that moment in A.B. Warburg's 1923 essay on Puebloan pictography, images from the region of the Pueblo Indians of North America, when he describes the Baroque features of a church in Acoma as basically indigenous in their representation of the evolution, ascents, and descents of nature, steps and ladders, the coiled serpent, the symbol for the rhythm of time, end quote. Warburg's point is that, though the Acoma Church might be ostensibly Christian, the hands and hearts that made it were unmistakably Puebloan, sneaking the symbol of the snake into those apparently peripheral ornaments and flares that surround the Christian iconography. Warburg points out the core role of the serpent for Pueblo rain ceremonies, especially in its association with the shape of thunder coming down from the skies, as a kind of iconographic smuggling act. He's also drawing on Frank Hamilton Cushing, who said very similar things about the church in Zuni Pueblo a couple of decades before Warburg gets out there, where Cushing says that in so many apparently peripheral ornamental features, the Zuni were able to sneak in thaumaturgical properties, right? Properties by which to continue to summon their gods. In this instance, he suggests, the Baroque is an imagistic ground for the sprouting up of indigenous self-representation. And in the case of San Xavier, the thunderous appearance of such a cosmic water being would be fitting for a church whose name, Bach, is derived from wa'ak, the Otham word for submergence. Watery conceptions flow beneath the locale, situated alongside the Santa Cruz River, always welcoming of rain for people making their life in desert heat and hostility. It has been pointed out that the greater share of traditional Otham ceremony has a, quote, hydrologic component. And further, it has been pointed out that these Otham rain beings were readily blended into Roman Catholic iconography in the hearts of the so-called Sonora Catholics, the quasi-converts, adherents to a religion of externals, as they were dismissively described by the mission priests, meaning that in their hearts and minds, the superficial relation between santos and rain spirits, of liturgy and rain ceremony was inextricably blended into a shared aim and substance. This is the classic tale of colonial syncretism. But what strikes me, especially in seeing those jagged snakes along the colonnades, is not how the figure and form are blended, but how they sit in infelicitous relation. If waves, they are waves in a sea of broken glass, all angles trying to square themselves into a bulge, a lightning bolt-like snake over a stream of blue rain on red earth. They look to me like disturbance angles of a kind with infarction and infrastructural noise. My question is then, how does this conflict, this lightning cutting through the waves, recast? Because at the outset it depicts the Baroque. In what ways does such a term as the Baroque Americas seem at times tautological and the European Baroque oxymoronic? In asking these questions, I echo the work of historian Serge Grudzinski, who pointed out that the Baroque is nothing less than a scene of contestation between Castilian and indigenous regimes of ideological image work in the, quote, margin of belief created by mutually contrasting imagistic regimes. Spanish Christian on the one side, indigenous Mesoamerican on the other. Grudzinski goes so far as to suggest that Hernan Cortés, famous conquistador of the Mexica Empire, was one of the first Baroques. insofar as he was one of the first Europeans to obsess over the ideological power of images in this war of iconography. But more on that later. In rambling through the colonial church outside Tucson, in seeing its visionary distortions, this is reasonable to me. The Baroque is linked into epistemic crisis in the colonial Americas, and in its relation to the history of conquest, it is an aesthetic mode marked by the violence, anxiety, and zeal of annihilation. All this is true. The imperial power of the Baroque bulges like so many broken cornices. Still, it doesn't quite help to make sense of how that world historical crisis actually shapes the aesthetic and intellectual priorities of those hands and hearts on the other side of the art. Those creative agents who gave a contrasting serpentine figure to the otherwise steadily curving architectural molding. Those artists whose patterns cut against the relief. To me, this is the missing story in our understanding of the Baroque. What's been missing is the story of its necessary inflection in the cultural poetics of the Americas, a core intellectual resource for both its problematics and its possibilities. So today, I'd like to try to tell that story in my own way, to try to better conceptualize the Baroque. But to do that, in true Baroque fashion, I have to double back. To move forward, I have to redouble my path. I have to begin again by going to maybe the most iconic artist of the structure of catastrophe that is the Baroque, the late 16th century renegade painter, Michelangelo de Merisi, aka Caravaggio. As you will have maybe guessed at this point, what interests me about Caravaggio is his violence. He painted violent scenes, he painted them violently, and he lived an extremely violent life. I'll start with the life to work my way toward the art in its relation to the Baroque art of the Americas. Although Caravaggio was implicated in multiple assaults and murders, his most iconic one, the one that got him in the most trouble, was the murder of a nobleman of low repute, Ranuccio Tomassoni, on the Via Palacorda in Rome, May 28, 1606. Tomassoni's family came from Terni in southern Umbria, north of Rome, and had made their name in the military service of the Papal States. His father, Luke Antonio, had defended the Castle San Angelo and Pope Clement VII hiding inside during the brutal sack of Rome in 1527. By the mutinous troops of Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, who a decade later, that is, this Luke Antonio, rejoined this same Charles V, rehabilitated in the Pope's eyes, in the Savoy contingent of the Spanish army against the French, led by Charles V's rival, Francis I, of Protestant presumption and increasing desire to extend French colonialism in the New World to meet the presence there of Habsburg, Charles V's globally hyperextensive Holy Roman Empire. Confusing? Yes, I will come back to that. For now, just know this Ranuccio descended from such crisscross militarism and that his brothers were mated in it as well. One had served in the pontifical army and another in the wars in Flanders. As for Ranuccio, he was no soldier or mercenary. He hung on his brother's reputations to work as a pimp and petty criminal in Rome, a place then still recovering from its sack and still recalibrating its chaos of allegiances, populated with too many unemployed and bored soldiers, and tensely divided amongst its French, Spanish, German, and Dutch quarters. Ranuccio's family held on with the powerful Spanish-aligned House of Farnese. Hence, when Caravaggio killed him on the Palacorda, Tennis Street, reputedly, but not likely, over a game of tennis, the painter finally found his foot out of bounds. It wasn't Caravaggio's first murder, more on that in a bit too. It was only the one that got him in big trouble. Tomassoni's family was too important. Blood had to be paid for with blood. The bounty was the painter's head, as he himself started to depict while on the lam in gruesome self-portraits of his own decapitated head held like Goliath's by David with the blade pointed to the place where Caravaggio had sliced Tomassoni, the femoral artery running down the groin, a wound whose symbolic location suggested a conflict of a sexual nature. As if crudely castrated, Tomassoni bled to death from his genitals. Brutal and bloody filmmaker Sam Peckinpah could have been hired to enshrine the early myth of Caravaggio, scripting that resonant missive from the highest offices of Rome, which was, "Bring me the head of this Caravaggio." As with so many foundational myths for the sanctity of the state of exception, Caravaggio's story starts in a scene of sacred violence, outside the law, but nonetheless in service to pose and define it. That's how Teju Cole reads this time of fugitivity in the painter's life. In an essay published at the New York Times during the early months of the COVID pandemic, Cole's prose and photography juxtapose Caravaggio's fugitivity from Rome to contemporary Circum-Mediterranean migrations from Africa to Europe. Cole points out that the transit points for Caravaggio in 1606, when he was on the run, the port towns that served as his escape south from Rome, are the same transit points for migrants escaping north from Africa 400 years later. Naples, Palermo, Messina, and Syracuse in Sicily, and then Maleta in Malta, to name just a few. In the same sites that Europe today feels the crisis of the counter-colonial shock of migration, you will find paintings that Caravaggio made for hosts solicitous of his artistic exceptionality, turning a blind eye to his fugitivity. The Nativity with St. Francis and St. Lawrence, the raising of Lazarus, the adoration of the shepherds, the burial of St. Lucy, and the one before which he is again tried in absentia in Malta for another assault charge. He could not help himself. The beheading of St. John the Baptist. And again, to emphasize the theme of beheading, this is the only painting he ever signed. His name is actually scrawled from the blood pouring out of St. John's head. Teju Cole writes, "He'd gone to those cities because they were ports. A port is where a given territory is most amenable to arrival and to escape, where a stranger has a chance to feel less strange. I wanted to see something of what was happening at that moment outside, beyond the walls." Cole suggests there is a quality of migrancy to these places, marking Caravaggio's late work as a study in displacement and migration. This is a provocative reading of the painter's late work. To imagine these works as entangled with their painter's fugitivity is to realize how such locations function spatially in a scene of ongoing coloniality, the Mediterranean circa 1600 to now, as well as the states of exception that such coloniality creates. At the same time, though, to imagine that this painter is nothing more than a possible allegory for fraught sovereignty and migration is to ignore that his fugitivity was the result of much murder and mayhem. It's different. Cole himself complicates this question by his observation that Caravaggio, this is a Cole quote, "Caravaggio is the quintessential, uncontrollable artist, the genius to whom normal rules do not apply," end quote. The suggestion that such a life outside the law reflects on stateless itinerancy is suggestive, if also obviously troublesome. Cole is right, though, to point out that Caravaggio has become the consummate rebel artist. While he wasn't much considered after the 17th century, until Italian art historian Roberto Longhi rediscovered him in the mid-20th, by the century's end, he had become an avatar of the violence and suffering that defines the lives of some artists. Now, this is the part of the talk where, if there were world enough and time, I would walk you through all of Caravaggio's appearances, his constant appearances in 20th century art and culture as an avatar of rebellion, of an artist who lives outside all the rules. But instead, in the interest of time, I'm just going to quickly scan through adaptations, receptions, remediations, reworkings of the figure of Caravaggio, such as you find in the bizarrely violent, unviolent painting by Paul Cadmus, in Derek Jarman's famous last film before his HIV diagnosis, and David Caravaggio, the ne'er-do-well character of the English patient, the film and the book and the film, in Martin Scorsese, who said he learned to film the Johnny Boy scenes from Mean Streets from Caravaggio, and you can kind of see what he's getting at. Again, Boardwalk Empire, where you get little Easter eggs of Caravaggio, such as the Caravaggio paint right behind Steve Buscemi. And actually, whenever there's an arch villain that needs to be depicted, often filmmakers will tuck a Caravaggio painting in the background, such as you see on the Sandman. This painting is actually stolen and believed to be held by Italian mafia. Rap albums. Rap albums remediating Caravaggio. This is a work by an Iraqi artist, reworking of Caravaggio's Narcissus, but put on the Mosul River with all the pollution of the Mosul. This is a work of Borderlands art that also remediates the Caravaggio. It just comes up time and again. Oh yeah, and most recently, of course, if you saw the new Ripley, you'll see that Caravaggio plays this essential part in the plot's unfolding, which is not in the book, right? It's not in Patricia Highsmith's books, but it is in the new Ripley. Not to offer one more red herring here, but I think Michael Fried's putting him right there. Michael Fried, art historian, Michael Fried, putting him right there alongside Courbet in his capacity to give life to relations of absorption and address, those ways in which the scene of the painting assimilates the moment of the painting's viewing, is yet another way in which Caravaggio is cast as a rebel, in this case, a rebel even against time itself, right? No, not even temporal laws will hold him. Still, in all this enthusiasm for Caravaggio, the rebel, the outlaw, the artist outside all law, it seems that rather than know little about his work, what his followers care little about, or at least productively compartmentalize, is that this rebel wasn't on the run for art or lifestyle. He was on the run because he was a murderer. And it wasn't just Tomassoni. While he was receiving the most important commissions in Rome, he was doing regular stints at the Tor di Nona, his local jail. Been a lot of famous people who've gone through that jail, for assault, battery, harassment, slander, pimping, and armed robbery. He and his crew had already been implicated in other homicides. Their motto was nec spe nec metu, right? No hope, no fear, thug life. One time he brutally attacked a waiter who wouldn't tell him which of his artichokes had been cooked in butter or oil. I think the subtext here is a regional conflict. Caravaggio's crew was allied with the Spanish, so the question of butter or oil came down to a question of allegiance to the Spanish or French. All the more heated with the 15th century butter tax that the church had imposed on its northern congregants. Butter or oil, like the color of a headband, might mark a person as a member of one gang or another in some neighborhoods, was a question of high truth and consequences. Caravaggio wasn't just a rebel. He was an unrelenting catastrophe on legs. To be astonished by the catastrophe beneath the paintings is to be brought through their emergence from an underworld of intellectual history. The worlds of law and right turned upside down into so many scenes of mayhem, madness, discipline, and fugitivity. Is this then the Baroque? In so much astonished thinking, my mind has seized like a stone around a question about Caravaggio, but also about the Baroque, particularly regarding its murder and mayhem. My question of this mayhem by a genius to whom the normal rules do not apply is, why don't the normal rules apply? Is it artistic exceptionality? There have been other killer artists of exceptional talent. I'm talking about real murderers, right? Villon, Gesualdo, Cellini, Richard Dadd, William Burroughs come to mind. But none of them have quite the same iconicity for their mayhem that Caravaggio does. Probably because none had the same ongoing warrant to continue to rampage that he had. But how did he do it? For one, he had powerful friends, Costanza Colonna and Cardinal Francesco Maria del Monte, to name two prominent ones. But his commissions and protections were coming from many houses. This brings me back to that whirling pool of allegiances that troubled my account of Tomassoni's family's place in Rome. That is, there is a crisis of sovereignty in the Eternal City in these days. Like the twisting snakes of his Medusa's head, writhing into each other while also biting and at themselves at the same time, or indeed like Burroughs's post-war inner zone of Tangiers, Caravaggio's Rome was a state of lateral, writhing, and cross-biting powers and jurisdictions. Quarters of the city were not just regionally divided, France, Spain, and so on. There was also allegiances to ruling houses, Colonna, Medici, Farnese, and so on. In fact, this shield with Medusa's head was one of the few pagan themes in Caravaggio's oeuvre. This one made not for his Cardinal del Monte, but for the Medici of Florence. As I understand it, each of these houses had something like consular jurisdiction that allowed the Holy See to maintain order in the city, though these houses might be in conflict or outright war in Europe. So many lateral and biting sovereignties at the head made for a peripherality of sovereignty at its supposed center. Caravaggio could then skirt the law by living across so many twisting geopolitical snakes. Note also that this is a shield, perhaps the shield Perseus used to reflect the Medusa's face back at her, made for the Medici, presumably to reflect their geopolitical crisis of so many twisting snakes in Rome back at them. It is a reminder of their own troubled place in the geopolitical tectonics of early modern Europe, a representation perhaps even of their own serpent Queen Catherine, who had ruled France by force and cunning. Famously, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre was attributed to her, less than two decades before the painting's commission. Butter or oil? Perilously, while also perversely, both and. Though he is Teju Cole's stateless soul in the port towns of the Italian South, he benefited as an outlaw from the de facto state of exception in the heart of Roman Catholic Christendom. The qualifier of Roman Catholic for Christendom is key, because this centralization of power built out of so many lateral competing authorities is not a phenomenon that you find in the same twisty way in the Protestant North. It is based on the counter-reformational need to keep power near the Pope, and peripheralization of power at the center, in turn, extends from the Pope to the colonial peripheries. And here is where my argument pivots both back and forward to the Americas, where those problems of heterogeneous authority were raised to an inescapable complexity. Now for the theory. It was Walter Benjamin who brought me to this realization with his Trauerspiel book, Origin of German Tragic Drama. It is the somewhat bulky passage that set the idea in place. Bear with me while I work through this. I promise it'll be worth the takeaway. The extreme doctrine of princely power was, in its counter-reformational origins, and despite the alignment of parties, more spiritual and more profound than its modern reconception. If the modern concept of sovereignty amounts to a supreme executive power on the part of the ruler, the Baroque concept develops on the basis of a discussion of the state of exception, and makes it the most important function of the prince to avert this state. Whoever rules is from the beginning destined to be a possessor of dictatorial powers if war, revolt, and other catastrophes should bring about a state of exception. This assumption is characteristic of the Counter-Reformation. For an antithesis to the historical idea of the Restoration, the Baroque is faced with the idea of catastrophe, and it is on the basis of this antithetic that the theory of the state of exception is conceived. If, in fact, emergency law was no law at all for Kant, that goes together with his theological rationalism, right? He's not from the South. The religious man of the Baroque thus holds fast to the world because he feels himself being driven along with it toward a cataract. This is interesting here. There is no Baroque eschatology. And precisely for that reason, there is a mechanism that multiplies and exalts everything earthborn before it is delivered over to its end. The beyond is emptied of everything in which even the slightest breath of the world can be felt. And from it, the Baroque extracts a profusion of things that tended to elude every formation, and at its high point brings them to light in drastic form so as to clear at last heaven and to place it as vacuum in a condition to swallow up the earth one day with catastrophic violence. What's he talking about? Benjamin's topic is the German mourning play in the catastrophic Central European 30 Years' War of the early 17th century. This war is typically understood as a conflict between the Reformation forces and the Holy Roman Empire. But in classic form for Benjamin, he uses it to think about the mirror of history that these events gave to the so-called Counter-Reformation and its Baroquism. In doing so, he comes to a few startling theses. The first is the counterintuitive claim that the Baroque has no eschatology, no sense of an ending. One would think that this is negated by the teleological investment of a religious bureaucracy in end times, the book of Revelation, right? The always approaching novissimi of total apocalypse. Yet Benjamin assumes that the force of doomsday has been undercut by the vexed continuation of a world after so much doom, right? Apocalypse has happened and the world kept going, driven along toward a cataract that is no longer definitively apocalyptic. Though the period is defined by catastrophe, it has lost its eschatology. This leads Benjamin to his second grounding thesis, which is that only some have lost their sense of an ending. There is no eschatology particular to the Baroque, that is, the Counter-Reformation, because of its distinct non-Protestant anxieties about how beginnings are troubled by those contesting claims to power. There is no Baroque eschatology because before it is even delivered to the end of conscience or good works, it is captive to antithetics, Protestantism, that it must seek to control, suppress, assimilate, or get around. For Benjamin, the Reformation is obsessed with the ideal of endings, and the Counter-Reformation is fixated on the crisis of beginnings. Reformation presumes total power. Counter-Reformation knows the shock of multiple sources of power and authority. Reformation sets itself on maintaining that ideal of power. Counter-Reformation has to understand power in the absence of such an ideal. From such absence, Benjamin writes, emerges the Baroque state of exception. Sovereignty in the Baroque always begins with the problem of its own evacuation, meaning that Baroque sovereignty is already a scene of catastrophes multiplying and exalted. Taking this idea of catastrophic violence and the state of exception as touchstones of the Counter-Reformation and its Baroque expression to a higher scale, it also has explanatory force for Caravaggio's exceptional violence at the heart of Rome. The Roman snakes biting each other in his Medusa's head are a reminder that it was terror that made the Gorgon of the Baroque and not the Gorgon of the Baroque that made the terror. The terror of Rome's reach, of course, makes it to the Americas. But what I wish to point out today is that it wasn't just terror that arrived. The idea of a catastrophe set into motion by a crisis of competing, snaking, biting authorities also emerged. The state of exception in those first moments of conquest in the Americas was not premised on a lack of law or terra nullius, but on the manipulation of a conception of catastrophe based on too many legal systems, too many sources of authority. Per Benjamin's definition of the Counter-Reformation in the Baroque, it can be said thus, that the Counter-Reformation, in some ways, precedes the Reformation. It begins in the original counter with the Americas. To take a step back and explain. It is well known that competing claims to sovereignty were the motivating circumstances for the first laws to come out of Spain with regard to the indigenous people of the Americas. The 1512 laws of Burgos, for instance, forbade enslavement of the indigenous people because they had independent law and jurisdiction, what Spanish jurist Francisco de Vitoria called dominium, right? Dominium. The laws of Valladolid in 1513 limited the encomienda system because there pre-existed those territorial and political claims. The new laws of 1542 extended the rights of the people of the Americas, not on the grounds of an ideal universal sense of human law, but on an understanding that these people had their own laws and claims to sovereignty. Historian Francisco Fernando Cervantes points out in his recent book on the conquistadors that they acted not on a premise of lawlessness, weirdly, but indeed negotiated the crisis of competing claims to sovereignty to their favor. So, for instance, Hernan Cortes, who was explicitly forbidden from marching onto Tenochtitlan for legal and political reasons, invoked a medieval 13th century legal precedent, the Siete Partidas, as a text that legalized breaking the law in its totality in such conditions where the laws and their proliferation, quote, actually defeat their own purposes, unquote. Cortes could thus legalistically prevail with the argument that his forbidden conquest was in the spirit of the law in a place where the authority of Castilian and church law did not hold amidst too many contradictions in legal authority. This is what we might call Baroque sovereignty, which is a theory of violence coming directly from the conquistadors in the absence of a voice of authority on the subject of violence, their practical theorization of a real state of exception. In the absence of their ruler, their law was exceeded by a deficiency to be corrected only by he who could enforce it, a catastrophic art of destructive exception. Cortes, De Soto, de Alvarado, Pizarro, and their conquistador cronies were the practical theorists, many fresh from the Reconquista of the Iberian Peninsula from Muslims coming next to the Americas, with a theory of law where the law did not obtain. While others have seen the Baroque as an aesthetic phenomenon in response to counter-reformational reorientations to Protestant Europe, I see it as emerging from scenes of conquest in the Americas, in no small way oriented from the Reconquista. These were not, I emphasize, places that the Castilians and their collaborators in conquest understood to be in a state of nature. My colleague at Chicago, early modernist Tim Harrison, pointed me to Gentile and Grotius, especially the latter's earlier draft of De Jure Belliac Pacus, with reference to uses of the law of nature to justify Dutch East India Company theft of Portuguese treasures, loot from Indonesia off the waters of Singapore, with the question of how the Americas, when theorized as a state of nature, paradisical, though certainly not innocent, enables what Schmidt calls the state of legal exception. I thought about this question for a little bit. I responded a few days later, explaining that the question left me wondering if the context of North Atlantic colonialism wasn't different, fundamentally different from Spanish colonialism. Again, insofar as the Spaniards never invoked terra nullius, and they always said there was kings there. In the first instance, they thought they'd arrived to Asia, which they knew to be populated, and subsequent to that, everywhere they turned, they reported abundant human population, society, culture, laws. Of course, the latter would not prohibit them from thinking that these natives were naturals, indistinguishable from the trees and the hills through which they moved, but that proto-Enlightenment paradigm is not the paradigm that Cortes, De Soto, de Alvarado, or Pizarro are working in. To crib a bit of Roland's own writing here, I do not think that the post-Columbus arrivants were Petrarchan in their world sensibility. with some dangerous sense of world perfectibility, of a contained and containable whole. Rather, they were Gongorists, agents acting with an even more dangerous sense and realization of world imperfectibility, of its fracture, of its superimpositions. But to return to Benjamin, what he helps me to conceptualize is that such crises of sovereignty in the early colonial Americas are the catastrophes of history in the mirror of societal multiplicity. They are the state of derangement in political and intellectual authority that seems to me to define the sense of sovereignty in the counter-reformational sphere of the early modern world. Cortez was not the proto-Enlightenment figure that, say, Sir Walter Raleigh was. He was, I learned to argue, Baroque. And so to stay with Cortez for just another moment, you will note that the Baroque is something of a floating signifier. Right? Malcolm X has this quip, race is like a Cadillac, there's a new model every year, but the Baroque is that too. So from everyone from Nietzsche through Benjamin to Jose Lezama Lima, Sandui, Maraval, Lacan, Deleuze, Luis Zamora, Joseph Crematori most recently, there have been constant retheorizations of the Baroque. And in Q&A, I can say more of why I think that is. Peculiar intellectual formation. But what I wish to complicate now are the emancipatory ends in which such aesthetics are sometimes coded. And I wish to do that by pointing to the Baroquism of someone like Cortez, who was, as Grzinski insists, the first of that arrival to the Americas to see history as a hall of shattered mirrors. He was, after all, the first one to see St. James leading the Castilian forces into battle at Cintla in 1519 against the Chontal Maya of Tabasco. This was the first cavalry battle on the hemispheric mainland, so appropriately, Cortez invokes the same St. James, one of the 12 apostles of Christ, who had previously intervened to lead the Castilians into victory against their Moor foes on the Iberian Peninsula, hence earning himself the title Santiago Matamoros, right? St. James the Moor Killer. As you can see from this image, depictions of Santiago Matamoros show a Christian warrior on horseback trampling his foes, in this case, the Muslims of the Iberian Peninsula. But Cortez sees this same saint on the battlefields of the Americas, which results in many visual representations of Cortez. Here are some from the mid-16th century Tlaxcala Codex that visually reproduce the familiar iconography of St. James, but with a twist. Now the foes beneath the conquistador's horses trampling hooves, are the native peoples of the Americas, the Mexica and their allies. This is no mere visual coincidence, since the iconography of St. Santiago Matamoros soon takes on new features throughout the Americas as Santiago Mata Indios, right? Or St. James the Indian Killer. Turbaned heads replaced by feathered ones. Moros gave way to Mexicas, Incas, and so many others, with Cortez jumping into that hall of fracturing mirrors to claim his place of authority in it. If the Baroque is the art of so many fractured mirrors, as we see in these touchstone works of the Baroque Americas, then it was really Cortez who saw it first, insofar as he saw the power to seize authority in a crisis of repetitions and reduplications. And the mirrors don't end there or there. What's absolutely fascinating is that the Baroquism of Santiago continued into the 19th century, when the saint was transposed again in a patchwork of mestizo and indigenous coalition, when Santiago emerged anew, but now as an enemy of the Spaniards, known as Santiago Mata Españoles, right? His horse now trampling the frocked and capped bodies of the Spanish occupiers. By the 19th century, this anti-colonial St. James had been circulating in the Americas and the Caribbean, such that I was recently being driven around Little Haiti in Miami, and I saw a mural of St. James there. So I said to my companion, art curator Jean Moreno, I said, Santiago, and he said, nah, man, that's a Gunfarai. Agun Farai is an Orisha healer and a warrior, one of machete and iron fire and warge forged, who, it's understood, was there to help the Haitians when they drove the slaver French from the island in the late 18th and early 19th century. Santiago is Yoruba and Taino atop everything else. It is then that I sort of saw what Benjamin meant when he says the Baroque has no eschatology. A better translation might be that it has no teleology. Its crisis of authority spins out into a crisis of temporality, in which time doesn't move forward toward an exalted end so much as keeps looking back on itself, broken and multiple, same saint, same iconography, different bodies always trampled under a horse's hooves. Another definition for the Baroque: when dialectic becomes just a mirror or a mirroring process in which every beholder is forced to behold themselves beholding, both as beholder and beheld. As a person of the Americas made, I ask myself then, am I the one under the horse's hooves, or do I sit on the horse, heroically trampling? The lesson of the anxiety that induces states of Baroque sovereignty, I think, is that I am both. You'll remember that Caravaggio just as often painted himself as the beheader as the beheaded, the one holding the dagger to his enemy Tomassoni's femoral artery while also holding it to himself and having his slain head thus held in a sort of implicit conception of power as somehow always in front of a distorted mirror, looking at its failings and back at the beginnings of its failings. The claim here, then, is not that there is a genetic connection between the broken mirrors of the arts of violence in the Americas and the broken world of a Roman outlaw, so much as that mirroring itself is a Baroque intellectual formation, a historical a priori, if you will, where dialectic gives way to something like superimposition, the shadow work of history in the sharp light of world historical collapse. To conclude, then, I return to those visually painful oppositions of the San Xavier del Bac mission in Tucson with an eye to their intellectual networks, to try to arrive at some ways of understanding the indigeneity of such superimposition. If we allow that there is something like a fuzzy margin of belief in the snaking water glyph that encompasses the church, if we allow its watery snakeness the same self-verifying force that we allow to the Christian iconography, then it probably goes without saying that the appearance of this water snake here is problematic. In the Christian context, the snake would of course be associated with Satan, and in its association with Satan, associated with man's fall and present state of sin and mortality. The Otham, of course, have mediated this problem. The most striking of such mediations is their tradition of devil songs, or songs in which a devil sickness, usually the avarice associated with big ranching, is healed by devils who give spiritual seekers healing by way of dream songs. Thus, while the devilry is often associated with the avarice of the cattle industry, these devils often appear as ranchers or big cattlemen, big hat, kind of like the one I have on today, that illness is paradoxically treated by the help of those very same devils and their songs. One such song, collected by anthropologist David Kozak and Otham scholar David Lopez, reads, and I won't even try to read the Otham, read you the song translation. With the evening close, the songs begin. With the evening close, the songs begin. From inside, the devils emerged, where they breathed on me and massaged me. Kozak and Lopez point out that while such adjacency between the figure of the devil and social critique might recall Michael Tausig's writings on the proto-proletariat thinking of figures of the devil amongst Bolivian tin miners in the 1970s, the Otham devil is different, they say, in that he is hardly villainous. He's just not that evil. are not singularly evil. Rather, though he brings the sickness of avarice, he also brings the healing through song, quote, performing a sacrament for the benefit of living beings, sometimes even appearing as a rattlesnake, turtle, or spirit ghost to teach the people, end quote. This devil, then, at once concatenated in political economy, mythic origins, afterlife, living dreams, and the therapeutic exhalation in a colonial landscape, is himself a divine superimposition, not quite resolving into any single quality, but staying in the crisis of irreconcilability. As such, beholding and beheld, slayer and slain, this devil reminds me of a concept developed by Guatemalan art historian Oswaldo Chinchilla Mazariegos. That is, his idea that the figures and forms of the Americas could best be articulated as nodal subjects. Nodes, literal nodes within network theory. Nodal subjects is Mazariegos' way of addressing the tremendous archival lack, the losses and enforced forgetting in the Americas by way of critical and imaginative networks, concatenations by which to see an intellectual history connecting with itself, available nodes to available nodes. Chadwick Allen has likewise called such a way of looking with the network figures and forms of the Americas, quote, trans-indigenous lenses, unquote. I take this to mean not only a call to look with the objects of the Americas as they cross so many cataracts of remembrance and forgetting, the appearance, for instance, of the core crop of the Americas, maize, in the first festoons and grotesques of Europe, gave way to the Baroque, for instance, or the circulation of the Nahua goddess Tonantzin in so many inter-indigenous cultural networks here, extending up into the plains and the materials of the plains. But also, I think, a reckoning with the legal complexity and colonial violence in which the overarching aesthetic and intellectual superimpositions of something like the Baroque take hold. Devils like Caravaggio for sure, but devils that somehow heal nonetheless. Cortez's trampling horse that also, in the bewildering mirrors of history, becomes an equine force of counter-conquest. Therefore, to finish, the last claims that I wish to make are that in this retemporalization of the Baroque from the Americas outward, what I mean to emphasize is that it was not Spain that made the Americas, but the other way around. Likewise, by extension, to emphasize and cash out on my claim that the spirit of the Reformation precedes the Reformation, it must be said that it precedes it because it is motivated by an encounter and immersion in the Americas. In other words, the Baroque is indigenous. That is, it connects to itself intellectually by way of the crises and creative responses to crises in the Americas. I could, of course, go on to read many more Caravaggio paintings with you all here today, with special note of his own problems with figuration and form, his bizarre inability at foreshortening, his own crises of superimposition, whose shadow work suggests the crisis of bodies and objects in a room. Look, I could tell you of the sleepless night that I had looking at Cleopas's, after looking at Cleopas's thumbs here. Cleopas is the figure on the right, monstrously disproportionate thumbs. Which seem to be emphasized by Caravaggio insofar as Christ's thumb is like at the top of the picture rather than Christ's proper index, right? Christ has his thumb, and then we see Cleopas's monstrously distorted thumbs. And I can tell you how that brought me to think about Jacob Burckhardt's bizarre note that the Italian word for spirit is ombra, which brought me to think how strange it would be for Hegel's phenomenology not to be of Geist, but of shadows and the losses that light brings. That would certainly take me to Vico's conception of what is hidden from the light, of the time of the giants before the sky opened up with the lightning of abstraction, causing people to lose sight of the poetic origins of their thinking, found today only in the shadows. And that, of course, reminds me of the creation in the Popol Vuh, which takes place entirely in the darkness, but it is not a cosmic darkness. It is the darkness of colonialism. But in doing all that, you would see that in true Baroque form, I am starting to spin out into so many mirrors. So instead, I will come back to where I began on a drive from Tucson to Nogales, the mission at San Xavier del Bac. Thank you.
Question.
Well, Edgar, thank you very much for this. What can I say other than this Baroque talk?
Yeah.
The way you weave so many ideas and themes in such a magnificent way, and of course your main thesis about the Baroque being indigenous to the and American rather than European and Spanish is the ultimate Baroque turn, I think. Of the many things that really stand out for me and that I could pick, or that I would like to pick out with you in a longer conversation, I'll turn now just to one, and that is, in your concluding section where you turn to the Baroque representations, images of the Virgen de Guadalupe. And it strikes me that that's a distinctive manifestation of the Baroque than any other of your examples. For one thing, if only for the centralizing, the centering of gender, of the feminine.
Absolutely.
And what that means for the Baroque.
Yeah.
And it strikes me that that's an issue and a theme that is, I don't know how to say it other than that is repressed in every other aspect of your talk.
Yeah.
And for me, it emerges particularly in the sense that when we take into consideration that you could talk about the place of or lack of place of a figure like Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, right? In this moment and what she represents that is not represented by Caravaggio.
No.
Or, if we bring it into the contemporary, and retrospective representations of the Baroque in contemporary, 20th century art, let's say, Frida Kahlo. And I'm thinking in particular of, that magnificent one painting, which has always fascinated me, Unos Cuantos Piquetitos. I don't know if you remember that painting.
Oh, yeah.
It's a painting of a murder of a woman.
Yeah.
And her murderer simply saying to the judge, what are people worried or, complaining about? I only gave her a few small nips. So those Baroque moments, run through your argument, but don't emerge in your argument.
That's fantastic. To begin to unfold an answer to everything that's in that response, Sor Juana is in the book, Kahlo is in the book, and so is actually Georgia O'Keeffe, who I see as very Baroque each in their own respective engagements with superimposition, right, as the overarching quality of the Baroque, and especially the superimposition of epistemic orders and still not so much. And why they didn't make it here is because this talk is about violence. Right? It's about crime. It's about the relation between somebody like Cortez and Caravaggio. That that's kind of different from Sor Juana, right? But the way that it's not different is that there's a misreading of Sor Juana, I think, and I think Paz is responsible for this, where he kind of reads her through Dürer, and he's like, she's a contemplative melancholic. Right? That was how Paz kind of presents Sor Juana, and I just think that's absolutely wrong. I do think she was more violent. Right? I do think she was way more aggressive than we give her credit for. And yeah, I guess just as to say, I agree. You said something at the very beginning of your question, though, too, about like you're doing the Baroque, right? And that's an interesting phenomenon to me, which is this feature phenomenological feature of the Baroque where you can't look at it for too long before you start looking like it. As I was telling Roland earlier, you start to do it for some reason, and I think that's because um, 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 of its peculiar relation both to history and to like the circular or the superimposition, the non-dialectical. Right? And so a question for me that has come up with regard to this is, when has the Baroque become of intellectual interest? Right, and there's a few moments when it comes up. Right, it's between World War I and World War II. Right? It's the 60s and the 70s, and it's now. Right, and I think there's something about that where people turn to the Baroque in moments of world historical crisis, of deep world historical crisis, and yeah. Yeah.
Thank you, Edgar, for that really interesting and compelling talk. I was just trying to follow you all the way through that, but I guess I'd like you to talk a little bit more about the place of violence in your theorization of the Baroque, because it seems like there is no Baroque without violence being at the core, which makes us, and then why, obviously there's, with the conquest, and now there's such potential for incredible violence. So can you just talk a bit about that more? And then your final like flourish, like the Baroque is indigenous. So I'd like to push on that a little bit more, because when you're saying that it's indigenous, and it's indigenous like before the Spanish arrived, or only
No.
with the encounter?
Within the encounter. Yeah, absolutely. So I came from California public schooling, where the story that I learned of the colonization of California and of the Americas, and it's probably a story you all heard in your schools growing up, was indigenous bad, Spanish good, right? Indigenous repressed, Spanish progressive. Indigenous uneducated, Spanish civilizing. All that was gainfully trained out of me by higher education, right? But there was a kind of like a disbalance that happened too, where I stopped being able to see as the Spanish as anything outside of Black legend, right? Where then they became the arch villains, and they became like the impossible other, and yes, there is, I'll just say this, there is often a romanticization of what is the indigenous. And what I want to do with this project is to really see that middle ground, that tension point between the indigenous and the Castilians, as fraught, as dangerous, as devastating as it might be, as really being where a lot of these great works like the Popol Vuh come directly from. So the Popol Vuh doesn't begin in cosmic darkness, importantly, and I think to its credit, it begins in colonial darkness, here in the times of the teaching of Christ. Here in Christendom, we will bring light out of the eastern sky. We will bring the sun into existence. That's powerful to me. Right? To think about a people who had experienced by 1702, when the Popol Vuh was put to paper, 95% population loss. We lost about 1% of human population during COVID. Can you imagine if 95% of the people on Earth had died? And in an oral culture, everything that would disappear with all those people, law, history, poetry, medicine, science, and still, right? That's the context that the Popol Vuh begins in, and still to say, we will bring light out of the eastern sky. We will bring the sun into existence is extremely powerful for me. And still, you can't escape the colonial context of that, right? There's something to it. And yeah, and with this Baroque project, I'm trying to amplify and think through the world historical impact of that fraught, dangerous, devastating, destructive relation that for sure is like shot through with violence. It is violent. It is Benjamin's angel of history. Right? Even though it's like world creation and creativity and indigeneity precedes and exceeds this relation, but that's it's that scene that I'm interested in. Yeah.
Well, might as well get my question in too, to follow from Ramon and Paula, and try to think about what a fantastic talk. As I was telling you before the talk, I've been traveling to Italy quite a bit because I'm working with the translator of Gloria Anzaldua's Borderlands La Frontera by Paola Zaccaria, and working with a lot of post-colonial Italian feminists. And of course, they're always taking me to see Caravaggio. So I'm trying out, I think I understand
careful.
better why. But the thing about the Medusa is really quite interesting, because as you probably know, and because you've written on Gloria Anzaldúa, her first part of Borderlands was called, Entering into the Medusa, before she wrote Entering into Coatlicue.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm trying to get that sense of, what my former colleague Donna Haraway would call tentacular thinking.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if Anzaldúa appears again, because you wrote about her so brilliantly in your Signs of the Americas. So why that shift, you think, in Anzaldúa's thinking
Yeah.
from entering into the Medusa, which of course Donna then picked up 40 years later,
Mm-hmm.
and not entering into the Coatlicue state.
Yeah, and entering into the Medusa, and then like transforming that into
So,
Coatlicue.
so of course,
Yeah.
then the question is Gloria Anzaldúa Baroque?
Yeah, yes. Insofar as she is existing in a borderland space, right? Within that margin of epistemic crisis that gives rise to various superimpositions. And one way to think about this image by Caravaggio as related to Gloria Anzaldúa and as distinct from classical conceptions of the Medusa is if you look with your phone, right, like Greek sculpture of the Medusa or whatever, Roman sculpture of the Medusa, the snakes are never biting at themselves, right? They're like this. They may be coming at you, but they're never biting at themselves. And that's what's really distinct about this painting, is that you have lateral attacks and biting and danger and instability of order that completely shoots through, gives birth to something like Borderlands La Frontera. It's in the title, right?
Obviously, to the design of the Coatlicue uncovered during the making of the Mexico City.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah.
I'll have to look at it again. I don't know if they're biting each other.
Yeah. I think they're more braided in that. I don't think that they bite. I don't think that the epistemic anxiety is there. But I've written on that Coatlicue in another context, which kind of reminds me of Rome, in certain moments in Rome, where, like, as you know, the Coatlicue is a massive basalt sculpture, supremely heavy, but, and it was like propped and standing up, but for whatever reason, the bottom of it is also sculpted, right? So it looks to the earth, right? It's a representation that isn't just for the human world, it's also for the underworld. And so much of what Caravaggio is engaging with is criminal underworld, right? It's like looking below, is descending into the pits of history.
Of course, it's a descent into Mictlán.
Yeah. 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 The book has many objects. If you think this is wild, like, the book has got like many more objects. And one thing, I mean, this is just kind of, I think it's, again, conditional of the Baroque, right? It's part of the condition of the Baroque, is, philosophically, what is the big basket for all that? Right? What is that big basket? There are we can nest baskets within baskets within baskets within baskets. And I've been trying to think, well, what is the big basket that could hold someone like Sor Juana, that could hold someone like Anzaldúa, that could hold someone like Caravaggio, that could hold someone like Carlo Gesualdo, maybe even Bach, right? Like, all these people who are described as Bach, what is that big basket? And I have come to understand that it is superimposition in resistance to and as distinct from dialectical thinking, right? Different from dialectical thinking. And Nietzsche was the first one to say this. He's not saying it in the way that I'm saying it, but he says, Baroque emerges from insufficient dialectic and overwhelming impulse to form, right? Overwhelming impulse to form that emerges out of insufficient dialectic. And he's not saying insufficient dialectic disparagingly, because he's talking about how much he hates Socrates and the Socratic dialectic, right? But he's, but what is this impulse to form? It's anti-plot, it's like anti-drama, it's post-dramatic, it's the actor. It's the actor in the drama, the actor which always messes up the pure plot of history, right? So in that way, like, yeah, it is historical, but then it like goes back to Aristotle. It keeps coming up with this, repetitious force.
I want to ask a question from the online audience.
Right.
Is it possible to talk of resistance or a resistance that is more than the spectacle of cultural collision in Baroque art? And then this person goes on to write, Benjamin entirely misses the Trauerspiel that represents resistance to imperial tyranny, or that figures an equivocal clash of forces.
Yeah, I think that the resistance is right there in the ability for self-representation amidst the collision of orders, in the very image, the capacity to create an image, right? The snake over the cornices at Xavier Delbecq, by which not only indigenous representational orders continue, that's not the point, right? It's not just a representation. That's the snake, right? It has thaumaturgical properties. It is a living being, right? And that being gets to continue by way of the blurry margin of belief, this collision that the Baroque instantiates. So that's where I would say the scene or the source of resistance within the framework that I've
Maybe a reference you already worked into your weave, which I loved all the way. But another former Humanities Center fellow years ago was Mary Pratt, and I just wondered if her notion of the Eastern arts to context zone isn't something that has sort of immense resonance with what you're doing.
Absolutely. And if anything, what I am trying to recover that is maybe different or distinct here is the circulation of those kinds of intellectual formations, right, that are made in colonial contact zones in the apparently only ever European, right? Like in someone like Caravaggio, to see the contact zone, let's call it that for now, in Caravaggio, right? A scene of epistemic crisis coming from the colonial encounter, but recirculating in lateral and surprising ways throughout Europe. Yeah, thank you.
Shall we wrap up here and we can continue the conversation in the reception? As I mentioned, we're lucky to have Edgar on campus for a couple of days, and tomorrow, 1 to 2 p.m. here in the boardroom down the hall, he will be offering a workshop open to Stanford graduate students. If you are such a person and you haven't registered, you can go to the events page for this event and sign up for it. And it's open to everybody who's a grad student. And then tomorrow night, we will see him back here again in this room at 7 p.m. for an episode of the radio show and podcast Philosophy Talk. The program is titled Crisis and Creativity in Mayan Mythology. And I want to thank everybody that joined us in person and online. Our next event here is December 5th, but it's actually online only. It's one of our very few online only events. It's presented as part of our series called Inside the Center, in which we celebrate the work of former fellows at the Humanities Center. We'll be joined by Dylan Penningroth of Berkeley, who was a fellow 11 years ago, and who his latest book, Before the Movement, The Hidden History of Black Civil Rights, has just appeared. And we will have an online Inside the Center event in which he will be in conversation with the Stanford historian Jim Campbell. There's a page for that event on our website. And many more events around after that and continuing on for the rest of the year. It's a very busy year here. Details always available at shc.stanford.edu. Please join us for a reception either outside, or if it's cold, grab something and come inside. Let's thank Edgar again for a wonderful talk.